What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we dive into 5 budget decks I came up with, kind of taking some meta decks, stripping them all of their mythics and rares, and did my best to create a more common, uncommon version of the deck and kind of show you the upgrade path to then get to the meta version of said deck. With that being said, let's just dive into the decks and kind of discuss each one of them. So the first deck up on this list is going to be Budget Soldiers. Budget Soldiers is kind of like that deck that is kind of the easiest to access as a new player because you kind of unlock the general deck when you do the dual colored starter decks. All these rares that are sitting over here are actually all part of that starter deck, so all these cards you should have in your collection if you have that unlocked. What we did here outside of the starter deck is we kind of swapped in some cards that the deck didn't include. We also got rid of the alchemy only cards and kind of kept the deck legal for a standard. So if that's the only other thing I would say that we adjusted from the actual starter deck, we kind of fixed up the mana base. We added in some secluded courtyards, which is going to work very well because you can choose a creature type and this land will produce mana of any color to cast creatures of that chosen type. And with us having a very focused soldier deck, it'll allow us to pretty much cast any of it, and it only being uncommon, it is definitely very good. Other than that, this deck is pretty powerful. It does a lot of good things, and it's definitely very easy to get into, like I said, as it is a deck that you kind of get unlocked as you kind of do the new player experience. So here is the first iteration of the deck list. This is actually just add in 4 additional rare wild cards of cards to the deck. What we did here is we added some Valiant Veterans to kind of go up to 4 copies of which we replaced the Copper Grove Vanguards we had in here. We also added in 1 additional copy of Siege Veteran, as I do think these 2 cards kind of help overall with the deck's power. Getting this out early is definitely going to help you with your team, get your squad a little bit stronger a little bit earlier. This is definitely something you kind of want to consistently draw into. Even though we do have the Orient Tactician, this is definitely a much better card just because it is overall cheaper, plus has a secondary effect that if it's in the graveyard, we can exile and put +1/+1 counters to each soldier we control. And the thing with Siege Veteran, this is another great card because it will slowly build up our battlefield by giving a creature a +1/+1 counter, and then make it so that even if we lose a soldier, if it's a non-token soldier, we'll get a 1/1 to replace it, so we kind of keep that board state going. And then in the sideboard, what I did here is kind of show you what I kind of cut down to kind of get to this. We cut down the Tacticians, we cut out the Copper Grove Vanguards, which pretty much allowed us to kind of fill in for the Valiant Veterans and also the Siege Veteran. Now, the next version here, we kind of get a little bit more into add in a bunch more cards. We add in additional mythics with additional copies of Merrill. We add in additional copies of Harbin. We also add in some additional copies of Skystrike Officer. That is kind of where we go when it comes to cards that are already in the deck. What we also do here is we add in Thalia, Guardian of Throbbing. This is another great card that is going to punish your opponents, especially if they have a lot of the removal is going to be non-creature spells, making them all have attacks of additional 1 is definitely going to help you out overall. And definitely it's getting closer and closer to said meta version of the deck. As you kind of see here, there are some stragglers of some cards that were originally in the original deck, but I do think this is probably getting as close to it without upgrading a few other pieces like the lands and a couple other rares / mythics that we haven't added into it. And there's a few other cards that we haven't gone up to 4 copies of, which I do recommend as you kind of slowly progress. But I do think fleshing out some of the other cards before you kind of go all the way up to 4 copies of some of like cards like Siege Veteran are definitely going to be the best way to go with, and definitely approach this deck when it comes to upgrading. And as you see here in the sideboard, these are the cards we kind of cut out. We got rid of the Paratroopers, we got rid of the Sentinels. Though there is argument that you could keep the Sentinels in, as this is definitely kind of one of those cards that kind of helps you protect things on your side of the battlefield. You can either cast it to get additional triggers of like a Resolute Reinforcements, or if your opponent tries to target a particular card with removal, you can flash this in, bounce that card back to your hand, and then you get a +1/+1 counter on it. And then you have the Gavony Dawnguard. As we kind of flush things out, this is going to be one of those cards we're going to slowly cut out just because it's not as effective as we need the space to fill in for the other cards. So overall, this is probably like the next step to what we did previously overall for soldiers. And here we have the final version of the deck. This is going to be as close to the meta version of the deck as you're going to get. I do think there are slight variations depending on where you look for the meta version, but this is kind of the meta version I went with. Some of the cards we kind of increased into the list are going to be the Siege Veterans. We finally went up to 4 copies of it. We also added in copies of Brutal Cathar because we are playing Thalia. We want Brutal Cathar here because we're not trying to cast non-creature spells, and Brutal Cathar essentially replaces our ossifications. It is a human on the front side, it's a werewolf on the back side, but the front side is kind of the most important part, as this is going to not be impacted by the attacks of Thalia's ability. And when it comes to cards we cut, you can see here we cut the ossifications, we cut the Lone Dawnguard, we cut the Skybridge Towers and Tranquil Coves to get into the untapped dual lands when it comes to Adhikar Waste, Fortified Beachhead. We also did a copy of Plaza of Heroes, if that's the way you want to go. And then we added in a Ganjo and Otawara, which just kind of replaces a plains and an island. Pretty straightforward there, but this is definitely another good deck. I do think that is very enjoyable. If you like the Soldier starter deck, this is kind of where you probably will want to go eventually with that starter deck. Moving on to the next deck on the list, we have Budget Humans. Budget Humans is another powerful deck in the format, as all the cards, as you slowly upgrade the deck, get more and more impactful. It's kind of similar in some ways, as it does include some of the cards that you may have seen in the prior list, just because those cards are definitely good. And because those cards were humans, it's just likely that they work just the same in this deck list as well. It makes a card like Coppercoat Vanguard as being an uncommon, a very strong card, with it being a 2-mana 2/2, giving each of your humans +1/+0 and Ward of 1, more effective than the previous list. And this list here doesn't include any rares and or mythics, so this is definitely very approachable if you only have commons and uncommons to really build this out. Plays a decent amount of removal when it comes to trying to get rid of things on the battlefield. We have Lay Down Arms, we have Elspeth's Smite here in case of certain combat tricks, and Ossification also makes an appearance because it's probably one of the better monocolored removal spells, because it goes to a basic land, and if your opponent has any sort of enchantment removal, it's definitely going to do a good job. Overall, this deck is pretty solid, even in its budget form. With the first iteration of the Budget Humans deck, we go ahead and add in Knight Errant of Eos. This is a very strong card, especially for this deck, as most of the cards in our deck are converted mana cost 2 or less outside of the Resistance Squad. This is a card that has Convoke, which we can use creatures to tap to help cast this, so you can essentially not pay 5 for it. You can pay like 3, you can pay 2, depending on how many creatures you have out. And basically what happens is, based on how many cards you convoke with it, you look at the top 6 cards of your library, and you can reel up to 2 creature cards with that converted mana cost or less and add them to your hand, which is definitely very good. It keeps our hand full, keeps the pressure on our opponent, and if they don't deal with what's currently on the battlefield, they'll eventually have to deal with what we could play afterwards, even if they remove the battlefield. Other than that, really no other major changes to the list. These are the cards we kind of took out to kind of get there. We got rid of the Galvany Dawn Guards because I think the Knight Errant Eos is a much better version of this card. And we also got rid of a copy or 2 of Resistance Squad to go down to 2 copies. Other than that, the 1 and 2 drops really haven't changed here, and this is definitely another good iteration on the initial list. Now, going into the third iteration here, we do get a little more powerful when it comes to what we add into it. I think here we only added in 8 total cards of rare or higher quality, 4 of them being 4 copies of Adeline, as she's going to be another great card for a humans-based deck because her power is based on how many creatures you have out. Whenever a creature you control attacks, you also get a human creature token that's also tapped and attacking, so the board will get very wide very quickly, and she's going to be the captain of doing that. The other card here is we add in a card called Intrepid Adversary. This is a card that is a 2-mana 3/1 with lifelink, which is definitely very solid. And if we have any extra mana open, we can spend 2 of that mana X amount of times, depending on how much we can pay, and he'll get that many Valor counters based on how many times we paid. And what happens with those Valor counters, depending on how many we have, each creature we control will get +1/+1 for each counter that are on him for the Valor. So definitely 2 good cards that definitely make this deck much stronger. In order to get to this point, what we did here is we got rid of the farm hands, we got rid of the Cathar Commandos, and we got rid of the Resistance Squads, which I think Adeline's a much better card to have in your 3-drop for this deck. And I do think this is, looking fairly close to that end game version of this deck overall. And here is the final version of the list. This is kind of like the pinnacle meta version of a humans list if you're looking for one. What we do here from the previous version is we add in 4 copies of Brutal Cathar, just like the Soldiers deck. We also add in Thalia, just like the Soldiers deck. These 2 cards are very ubiquitous with mono white, as these are very powerful cards. We also add in here is copies of Hopeful Initiate, as this is a card that will grow as long as it's attacking with other cards that are stronger than it, and you can remove counters from it to destroy target artifact or enchantment, which is definitely very good. But I do think the training with this and pair it up with a card like Athalia or any of our other 2-drops is going to be very good as well. And then we added in 2 copies of Skrelv, as this is another great card that helps protect our creatures because of its ability to tap and choose a color and give target creature Toxic 1 hexproof from that color, and then it can't be blocked by creatures of that color. This card here is a very solid card when it comes to helping protect our overall creature types, especially the very important ones like an Adeline, like a Brutal Cathar, maybe an Intrepid Adversary. Protecting those cards from any sort of removal is going to be very beneficial, and then they have to remove this first before they can remove any of those. When it comes to add-in things or cut-in things to get here, we got rid of the Smites, we got rid of the Lay Down Arms because these 2 cards don't pair well with Thalia. These cards get taxed, so we these are easy cuts. We also cut some copies of the Mark Veteran. We also cut copies of Ossification. And we also cut out Rafine's Informant to kind of fit in the rest of the list. But overall, I do think this is definitely a solid list to also go with. Maybe you weren't feeling the soldiers, but maybe you like the human style of things. This is definitely another iteration of where to go when it comes to playing in these colors. Moving into the next budget deck, the first deck that I have here in the red color is going to be Budget Burn. Budget Burn is actually pretty effective in what it's trying to do. The goal is it's just playing a bunch of spells that will deal damage directly to your opponent's face or put pressure on your opponent's life total just by playing creatures that get bigger or stronger the more spells you cast. Overall, this deck list is pretty straightforward. A lot of 1-drops, a lot of 2-drops, and basically everything that is in here either has haste or it does some sort of damage to your opponent's face one way or the other. Has things like End Festivities. In this version, it's maybe not its best form because the more upgraded version, this card gets a lot better. But being able to deal 1 damage for 1 mana is definitely very good at sorcery speed. Also, it deals damage to your opponent's creatures, so if they have little tokens or something like that, this will definitely help get rid of those. Kamano Faces Kakazan has become like a card that you see in every red deck just because of its ability to, on chapter 2, get a creature with additional +1/+1 counter, get a creature on turn 3 that also has haste and can attack, so definitely very good there. Monastery Swiftspear, same thing. In any red deck, you probably see this card because of its strength, it being 1 mana for a 1/2 with prowess. Phoenix Chick, also same thing, a 1/1 flyer with haste, and also can get back from the graveyard by paying 2 additional mana if you're attacking with 3 or more other creatures. Play with Fire, a 1 mana shock, and then you get a scry if it is dealt to your opponent's face, which is definitely very good. Epicure is good for this deck because of it being a 1 mana 1/1 that deals 1 when it comes in the battlefield. And you also create a blood token, which then can be used to get rid of cards maybe that aren't good in the situation that you're in when it comes to the games. In the 2-drop slot, we go into Infantry here. This is a card that will grow every time we cast a burn spell because it will get a +1/+1 counter each time we actually cast an instant or sorcery spell, and our deck is just full of them. We got Lightning Strike here, 3 damage for 2 mana. We have Reckless Impulse, which helps us dig a little bit and allows us to play cards that we exile with off the top of our library until our next turn. And then Stoke the Flames in here as kind of like that big finisher, it being 4 mana. We are able to convoke it if we need to make it cheaper, and it deals 4 damage to any target at instant speed, which is definitely very good. And because we are so low to the ground, 20 lands is perfectly fine for this iteration of the deck. Moving on to what I would first upgrade to make this deck even more powerful, it's added in a card called Mechanized Warfare. Pretty much it turns all our red sources or artifact sources that would deal damage to an opponent, deals that much damage +1. So it turns a card like an Epicure from an entering the battlefield, deal 1 damage to each opponent, into a 1 mana, deal 2 damage to each opponent if this is out. And then this stacks depending on how many copies you have out. So if you have 2 of them, it'll get +2, 3 of them +3, and if you have a full set, you have +4. It turns a card like End Festivities also into a very good card because this also becomes, 1 damage, turns into 2 damage, so on and so forth. It makes things with Play with Fire that much better, turns Play with Fire into a Lightning Bolt at this point with Scry. Lightning Strike turns into a 4 mana, Stoke the Flames, but for 2 mana, which is definitely very good. And then even our creatures, when they attack, also added that additional pressure on. So Mechanized Warfare, I would say, is like the first big upgrade for this list. And all we did was cut out the Stoke the Flames and added that card in because this is a little bit cheaper. Sure, this can be convoked, but I do think having this card with all these cards is a much better option than keeping the Stoke the Flames in the deck. And there's only one more version of this deck that you really can go up to because it doesn't really add in too many additional cards from what was in here prior. All we really did is add in Veldin Ronam of Excavator to 2 mana, 2/2 with haste, and if it's ever dealt damage, you get to exile that many cards off the top of your library, and then you get to choose one of them until your next turn you can play that card. So this is kind of one of those hard cards to deal with because you have to have direct removal, or this card is definitely going to draw you a few cards if they block it, or even if they deal direct damage to it, it's going to, get you some cards in that way. Other than that, we added in 1 copy of Chandra Dressed to Kill, as she's kind of like a good planeswalker for 3 mana that we can +1 get a red mana if we need it, and deal 1 damage to target player or planeswalker, which combined with Mechanized Warfare turns into +1, deal 2 damage, or so on and so forth, depending on how many you have out. And then also her other +1 ability is you exile top card of your library. If it's red, you may cast it this turn, so helping us dig a little bit deeper, just like Reckless Impulse, to find more answers. 1 copy of Squee in here, just because if we want to go the more aggro game, Squee is a great card to have 1 copy of, because whenever he attacks, you create a 1/1 red goblin creature also that's tapped and attacking, which combined with Mechanized Warfare, these cards will deal that much additional damage to your opponent. So Squee will deal 3 and the token will deal 2, which is definitely very good. And we actually just added in 1 copy of Sokuzan just as a card here, just to help us with with turning a red mana source into possibly creatures, because you can cycle it for 4 mana and create 2 1/1 color spirit creature tokens with haste, which then can immediately attack, which is definitely very good. Or if you need some sort of chump blockers, this is a card that just replaces a mountain, and you get a little bit of an additional effect. All we did to get here was we just cut out the infantries. We cut out all 4 copies of infantries plus the mountain for the Sokozan. So definitely a pretty solid list compared to the other decks that we've kind of gone over so far. Very budget friendly, as I do think there's only 7 total rares in here plus 1 mythic. So definitely very approachable for a new player who may not have a ton of wild cards to really go with. So just like the humans/soldiers, we are kind of still in the same color scheme, but we're going to go focus on our red deck and be a more aggro deck. In this base version of the list, it is very similar to what we were doing prior. The only difference I would say is that instead of adding Stoke the Flames, that we added in Monstrous Rage here, as this is a card that's going to pump our creatures at instant speed, give them a monster roll token, which gives them additional +1/+1 and trample, making them a little bit more stronger, a little bit more powerful, making them a little bit harder to block, which allows us to get that additional points of damage in. Like with a Monastery Swift Spear, if you Monstrous Rage it, it will get +1/+1 from the prowess, it will get +1/+1 from the roll token, it will gain trample from the roll token, and then it will also gain the +2/+0 on top of all that. So turns the Monastery Swift Spear into a very big attacker very, very quickly. Overall, the list outside of that is very similar to the burn list. That is really the only difference, is that this is here in this list instead of Stoke the Flames. Other than that, everything else is kind of exactly the same as the other list. Now, moving into the second iteration of the list is where we kind of go a little bit more additions compared to what we did prior. Here we bring in copies of Feldins here, just because it's a solid card. This is a card you definitely want in a more aggro list, because it's a card that is going to put pressure on your opponent's life total very quickly. Combine that with things like Monstrous Rage, helping us dig deeper into our deck with itself. We also added in copies of Bloodthirsty Adversary as being kind of that card that helps us recast instants and sorceries from our graveyard. So it will allow us to recast things like Monstrous Rage, help us recast things like Play of Fire, also Lightning Strike, Reckless Impulse. Any of our sorceries or instants, as long as we pay that additional 3 mana on top of its 2 mana, this card will help us kind of put pressure on our opponent's life total in the later game when we're trying to finish off our opponent, which is definitely very good, and itself is a 2 mana 2/2 with haste, so if you just cast it just like that, it's also still very powerful. And all we did here is we cut copies of End Festivities because we are more aggro. We're not really trying to do End Festivities things because we aren't adding Mechanized Warfares. Same thing with infantries. We kind of start adding more creatures, which makes adding cards like infantry kind of not as good because we aren't casting as many instants and sorceries that we may be in the burn version of the deck. So this is also a card that will get cut in this iteration of it overall. Now moving on to its third iteration, I would say the only big change here is we add in some Godric's, which is another card that is very powerful, definitely very good with various cards in our deck because of its celebration ability. As long as 2 or more non-land permanents enter the battlefield under our control this turn, it gets it becomes base power and toughness of a 4/4, turns into a dragon. Also gains the ability if you can tap red mana and dragons you control get +1/+0 at the end of turn. So it itself is a very strong card. It's a 3 mana 3/3 haster. You may be curious as to how we get this going. You do things like Vodarian Epicure combined with this. The blood token comes into the battlefield on top of the Epicure, causes 2 non-land permanents enter the battlefield, which then causes celebration to trigger. You could also do things like Kamano. Like Kamano's out in the battlefield, you cast this, it flips over, and then you cast another thing. That's a celebration trigger. So it's a very strong card. It's definitely very powerful. It is going to be like the next card I would say you would want to add that additional pressure. And all we did here is we cut out End Festivities because, like I said, this is the more aggro version, not a burn version. And we kind of trimmed out some copies of Reckless Impulse, which is, slowly not as good as you are just trying to, draw a perfect open in hand or a good start in hand that you will put a lot of pressure on very quickly. And Impulse kind of clogs up, what we're trying to do because it doesn't pair well with things like Godric because it's not putting anything onto the battlefield. So I do think Reckless Impulse is definitely a card that you probably want to cut first. And then here is the final version of the deck. And just like the burn version, there are some cards that, share because they are just that good in the meta overall when it comes to red. We added in 2 copies of Chandra Dress to Kill because we cut the Reckless Impulse. Chandra Dress to Kill's +1 ability kind of turns into that. Her other ability is still also very good, allows us to get that 1 additional mana, maybe then to cast 2 creatures on a given turn. or get an additional mana to cast a burn spell, also pings for 1. We also added in Squee, because Squee pairs very well with Godric. These two together, the Squee token then causes Godric's trigger to come into the battlefield. If Squee came into the battlefield during the turn, you immediately go to the combat step. Other than that, the only other changes to the list is that we added in, Sokuzan to the mana base, and we also added in Mishra's Foundry, as this is another card that also adds additional pressure, because even though it doesn't produce red mana, it can become a 2/2 assembly worker creature token that's still a land, so it kind of helps us keep the board wide or keep being aggressive, because we can turn this into a creature and also attack our opponent's life total. And all we did here is we got rid of the Epicures and we got rid of the Impulse. And this is kind of like the final mono red version of the list. If you're looking to go the more aggro side of things instead of the more burn version, definitely a very good deck, as well as mono red is kind of one of those decks you always see in the meta just because of how strong and how quickly it can win games because of its aggressiveness with all the cards. And moving into the final budget deck that I have here on the list, we're going to go into Budget Enchantments. Budget Enchantments is also a very strong deck. It's a very powerful deck too, even in its budget form. You have cards like Jukai Naturalist here, which makes all our enchantment spells cost 1 less to cast, making a lot of our cards that are in the higher mana sources only cost 1 mana, which is very powerful overall, because that then allows us to cast multiple spells, which then allows us to get multiple Generous Visitor triggers, which is going to be very good. It turns a card like Ossification into a 1 mana removal. It turns a card like Borrowed Time into a 2 mana removal. It turns in our Mishako's Reign of Truth into a 1 mana enchantment that is very strong with its first 2 chapters. On top of that, it does have the flip ability, which is definitely very good. Spirit Companion becomes a 1 mana draw card kind of dog creature. The only thing that is a little bit awkward, I would say here, that may not fit 100% is probably the Kindly Ancestor. The reason why I added this into the list is, sure, it's a 3 mana 2/3 with lifelink, but if you are able to get this in the graveyard, you can disturb it and then give one of your creatures lifelink, which I think is pretty powerful. This is probably the one slot I was not 100% sure on, but I do feel like it works all right overall with the rest of the deck. Even if this is kind of like a chump blocker and then it goes to the graveyard, any sort of way that you can make this kind of go into the graveyard to cast it for its flip effect is going to be very good. And then in the 1 mana slot as well, we also have Audacity here as I think a very powerful enchantment aura, which we can enchant our creature, giving it +2/+0 and trample. And if it go to the graveyard, we would get to draw a card, and Commune with Spirits allows us to dig a little bit deeper off the top of our library and reveal an enchantment or a land. Our deck is mostly enchantments and or lands, so we are going to probably hit on that pretty much all the time. But nonetheless, this is definitely a very solid list, and I do think the only rare that's in here is the Razorverge Thicket, which I do believe you get in the green and white starter deck, so you should be able to have at least 1 copy of this. Other than that, let's move on to the next iteration. So the next iteration doesn't really change too much of the original deck list. All we really do here is we add in Calyx, as I do think he's kind of like the key card to make this deck that much more powerful. Himself is a very strong card in the fact that whenever he or another enchantment enters the battlefield under our control, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature, which is just like Generous Visitor, but he himself is also an enchantment, so we get the trigger immediately. And then whenever he or an enchanted creature we control deals combat damage to a player, we can create a token that's a copy of a non-legendary enchantment we control, and pretty much we get to recast that card, which is pretty effective overall because you can cast copies of Mishako's Reign of Truth, you can cast copies of Ossification, Borrowed Time, Spirit Companion, Jukai Naturalist. Any of those cards are going to be very good, I guess, creating additional copies of, and Calyx is kind of like going to be that card that's going to allow us to put pressure on our opponent's life total very, very quickly and make them have to have answers for all the enchantments we're going to create with it. Other than that, we also added in our Catilda here. This is a card that kind of grows as we have, depending on how many enchantments and or spirits we control. Really, the focus here is with the enchantments, because we are strictly an enchantment deck. This card could be very powerful with its front side. Also, just like the previous card that was in the budget version, it does have an ability that you can disturb it from the graveyard for 5 mana and give whatever creature +X/+X lifelink and fly in based on how many enchantments you control, which is going to be very good as well. Other than that, no other really major changes into the rest of the list. And to kind of get here, all we really did was we got rid of the Kindly Ancestors, and I believe we actually also cut down on a land. As we kind of get further and further into the list, the deck overall casting costs will get cheaper and cheaper, with really these cards really only being the more expensive cards, but we have ways of discounting them so they aren't them being 3 mana is not really going to be a huge impact on our overall mana when it comes to casting things with the deck. Moving on to the third iteration of the deck, this is where we get some more powerful cards in the 2-drop slot. Overall, you see that we added in some copies of Weaver of Harmony, 4 copies of this. This is a card that buffs all our other enchantment creatures, which is definitely very good. We also added in copies of Kami of Transcience. This is a card that will grow every time we cast an enchantment spell. And then if our enchantment would die at the end of the turn, we can return Kami from the graveyard to our hand, which is definitely very powerful. So this is a card that your opponent has to pretty much exile, or this card is going to keep on coming back if they keep on killing any of your enchantments, which is definitely very powerful. Those are really the only additions from the prior list. We did cut down on a few cards, which we do have here. We got cut down on some copies of Commune with the Spirits. We got rid of all the Fingers Shigekis, and we got rid of all the Borrowed Times. So overall, as you see here, the list gets a little bit cheaper, a little bit stronger. We get more cards that have more synergy, that are very powerful when it comes to playing enchantments. And the one thing I forgot to mention when it comes to the Weaver Harmony, its secondary ability is that you can tap it and for 1 green and copy target activated or trigger ability we control from enchantment source. So we can target various enchantments that we are going to be casting in this version of the deck. So you can copy the Calyx ability, you can copy the Mashako's Reign of Truth ability, you can copy the Ossification ability, copy the Spirit Companion ability. Definitely very good overall, definitely very powerful. You will see a dramatic increase in overall power when you go to this version of the deck. So here is the final version of this list. This is like the meta version of the deck if you're looking for that version. Pretty much what happens here is we make some additional cuts, but we don't really add in too much to the list that from the prior version. What we do here is we add in copies of Skrelv. Just like the humans deck, Skrelv is a very strong card because of its protection ability with its tap ability, which is definitely very good. Works very well with this deck. Like if you have a big creature out on the battlefield because you have, Generous Visitor, you also have Calyx kind of pumping them up. You can protect that creature with Skrelv, allowing it to kind of avoid any sort of direct removal, and they have to remove the Skrelv before they can deal with that creature, which is definitely very powerful. Other than that, the only other changes we really made were in the mana base, as we kind of added in additional copies of Rage of Verge Thicket, we added in copies of Brushland, we added in some overgrown farmlands, and we added in copies of Aseju and Aganjo just in case, so as some additional ways to deal with things on the battlefield that may be a pain point. Really, all we did was cut down on copies of Commune with Spirits, and then we just got rid of the tap dual lands for the dual lands that we added, and with the Aseju and Aganjo, just cut down on Forest and Plains is kind of how I would approach going about adding those cards in. But this is definitely a very strong deck. If you've been playing MTG Arena for a while, you've probably seen some iteration from the deck. You probably have seen this version once Calyx got released with Aftermath. But overall, each of these decks I do think are fairly powerful. Definitely have good win rates. Definitely all good in each version of it. Though I would say as you kind of build up a deck, you'll kind of see how much better each deck gets as you add in more rares and mythics. Let me know what you guys think about this style of video. Do you like me giving you guys iterations of said meta decks, kind of showing you how to maybe go from a budget deck version of that meta deck into the more powerful version of that deck? Let me know in the comments below. If you like the video, hit that like button. It definitely helps out a lot. Lets me know you guys like these style of videos. If you're new here, you want to know when I post new videos like this one here on the channel, hit that subscribe button. But until next time, I'll see you in the next video.